Hospitals unsettled me. The bright lights, the sharp scent of antiseptic, it all felt too sterile, too detached. But the dull ache in my side had lingered for weeks, and my roommate's insistence had finally worn me down. The clinic was quiet, almost eerily so. I sat in the waiting area, flipping through an old sports magazine, trying to ignore the stiffness in my posture and the way time seemed to drag. The air smelled like disinfectant, sharp and artificial, a reminder that I didn't belong here. Then my name was called. I looked up, expecting nothing more than routine indifference. Instead, I saw her, a woman in blue scrubs, composed but warm in a way that caught me off guard. Clipboard in hand, she met my gaze with quiet authority, and something about her presence made my pulse quicken. I stood, following her without question, feeling a strange sense that this visit would linger with me longer than I'd expected. She led me down the hallway, her steps steady, unhurried. The exam room was as clinical as expected. White walls, medical charts, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She gestured for me to sit, her demeanor professional, yet there was something in the way she moved, the way her presence filled the space, that felt strangely grounding. "Remove your shirt," she instructed, reaching for the blood pressure cuff. I hesitated, not because of modesty, but because something about her attention made me hyper-aware of myself. As I pulled the fabric over my head, the air felt cooler against my skin, my heartbeat a little too noticeable. She must have sensed my tension. She didn't comment, but her movements slowed just slightly, her touch careful as she placed the cuff around my arm. A small pause, a glance at the monitor, then a faint crease in her brow. She had noticed. Her hands were cold at first, the stethoscope pressing against my chest as she listened to my heartbeat. I focused on the ceiling, on the steady rhythm of my breathing, but I couldn't ignore the awareness creeping over me. Every touch, clinical, routine, felt sharper, more noticeable. Her fingertips brushed against my skin as she adjusted the stethoscope, lingering just a second too long. My pulse quickened involuntarily. She noticed. Her eyes flicked up to mine, brief but knowing. A small note scribbled onto her chart, her expression unreadable. I told myself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just the odd atmosphere of being examined so closely. But as she straightened, stepping back slightly, the air between us felt different, charged with something unspoken. She gestured for me to lie back, her tone neutral, professional. I did as instructed, though the padded table felt colder than before. Her hands pressed along my abdomen, methodical and searching. "Tell me if this hurts," she said, her voice steady. But pain wasn't what I felt. It was the slow, deliberate way her fingers moved, the barely there hesitation between each touch. The space between us seemed to shrink. Her focus lingered, not just on the examination but on me. The air felt heavier, the silence stretching longer than it should. I swallowed, trying to ignore the way my skin prickled under her fingertips. This was just a checkup. Routine. Nothing more. Then, her hands moved lower and everything changed. Her hands slowed just above my waistband, fingers barely pressing into my skin. Then stillness. A pause too deliberate to ignore. I should have felt discomfort, maybe embarrassment, but instead, something else settled in, a slow, steady warmth spreading beneath my skin. A deep, almost electric awareness of her touch, of how close she was. The rise and fall of my breath felt too obvious, my pulse too loud in my ears. She didn't move right away. The weight of her fingers was barely there, but I felt them more than I should have. My stomach tensed beneath her touch, not from pain, but from something harder to name. Anticipation, curiosity, the moment stretched between us, thick with something neither of us acknowledged. Then, finally, she exhaled, a quiet, steadying breath, as if pulling herself back. Her fingers moved again, slower this time, her voice measured. "Let me know if you feel anything unusual." I already had. Her hands moved again, but slower now, almost careful. The charged silence between us remained, thick and unspoken. I told myself to stay still, to ignore the way my body responded to something so subtle. But the awareness wouldn't fade. Then, she paused again, her fingers pressing lightly against my skin. "Does this feel different to you?" Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it, something restrained. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Different. The word lingered in my mind because that was exactly it. Everything about this felt different. Not just the examination, not just her touch, but the air between us, the unspoken shift that neither of us dared acknowledge. I could have answered easily, a simple yes or no, but the weight of the moment held me in place, my pulse hammering beneath her fingertips, betraying everything I wasn't saying. She didn't move, neither did I, and in that stillness, everything changed. The shift was undeniable now. What had started as a routine examination had unraveled into something else, something neither of us had planned for, yet neither of us stopped. Her hands moved again, but the touch no longer felt purely clinical. There was a familiarity to it, an unspoken awareness woven between the measured presses of her fingertips. I felt it in the way she lingered, in the subtle hesitation before she withdrew. My breath felt uneven, my skin overly sensitive to every point of contact. It wasn't just nerves, it was reaction instinct. A slow, creeping realization that this moment had drifted far beyond the boundaries of professionalism. She must have felt it too, because when her gaze flickered to mine, there was no mistaking what passed between us, and neither of us looked away. Then suddenly she pulled away. The warmth of her touch vanished, replaced by the cool emptiness of distance. She moved quickly, her hands precise now, methodical, as if resetting the boundaries that had just blurred. I exhaled, only then realizing how long I had been holding my breath. The air between us, once thick with something unspoken, now felt sharp, almost cold. She turned, scribbling something onto her chart, her posture stiff, controlled. For a moment, I thought she might say something. A quiet acknowledgement, a carefully chosen word to smooth over what had just happened. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for her stethoscope, her voice neutral when she finally spoke. "You can sit up now." I did as instructed, though my body still felt tense, my skin still too aware of where her hands had been. As I pulled my shirt back on, I glanced at her. She wasn't looking at me, but I could see it. The way her fingers curled too tightly around the clipboard, the way her breath wasn't quite steady. She felt it too, but whatever had passed between us, she had already locked it away. And as I left the room, I could still feel her watching me. Days passed, but the moment refused to fade. It crept into quiet hours, settled in the spaces between my thoughts. The press of her hands, the weight of her gaze, the way the air had shifted between us, it all replayed like an echo I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing, a moment of crossed wires, a trick of proximity, but my body disagreed. Every time I caught myself thinking about it, I felt that same slow burn beneath my skin, the same tension winding through my chest. I should have let it go, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself back at the clinic, my excuse already formed before I even stepped inside. It was reckless, maybe even pointless, but the pull was stronger than reason. And when I saw her again, when her eyes met mine across the room, I knew I wasn't the only one who hadn't let it go. The moment our eyes met, I knew. There was no hesitation this time, no careful pretense. She didn't ask why I was back, and I didn't offer a reason. Instead, she simply turned, leading me down the familiar hallway. Her movements were precise, but something was different now, less restrained, more intentional. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing us off from the outside world. The small exam room felt even smaller, the silence thick between us. She stood there for a moment, clipboard in hand, as if considering whether to follow the script of professionalism or abandon it entirely. Then, with quiet certainty, she set the clipboard down. And just like that, the tension that had been simmering between us finally broke. The space between us disappeared in an instant. What had been careful hesitation before was now something undeniable, something neither of us could resist anymore. She reached for me first, quick, decisive, like she had already made up her mind long before I ever walked back through that door. Her hands were different now, no longer cautious, no longer bound by the routine of an exam. They pressed against my skin with intent, fingertips trailing in a way that sent a slow burn through me. My own hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she didn't resist. And then she kissed me. Soft at first, almost testing the weight of the decision she had just made. But as I deepened it, As my hand slipped to the small of her back, she let herself lean in, pressing closer, surrendering to the moment we had both tried to ignore. The clinic became our secret, the walls holding something unspoken yet impossible to forget. Every glance, every stolen touch carried the weight of the risk, but that only seemed to make it more intoxicating. We both knew we were crossing lines we couldn't uncross, but neither of us stopped. The more we met, the harder it became to stop. At first, it had been stolen moments, an excuse to linger in the exam room, the whisper of fingertips against skin, the press of lips that always left us breathless. But soon it wasn't enough. The space between our meetings felt unbearable, the pull between us undeniable. She wasn't the composed professional she had been before. Not with me. I saw the shift in her. The way she watched the door more carefully, the way her breath hitched when I touched her. And yet she never stepped away. If anything, she met me halfway, as if she needed this as much as I did. But with every encounter, the risk grew. It was reckless, dangerous, impossible to justify. And yet, we kept coming back, drawn together like something inevitable, something neither of us wanted to name. She tried to convince herself it had to stop. But I knew, just like I did, she wasn't ready to let go. Every time we parted, reality crashed back in. She would fix her scrubs. She would gather it into a loose ponytail, as if grounding herself, as if wearing the aftermath of our moments like an unspoken admission. And then, without a word, she would slip away, to the utility room, to the back hallway, anywhere she could steal a moment to compose herself before stepping back into the world that expected her to be untouchable. I would leave the clinic, my pulse still unsteady, her touch still lingering on my skin. And then the guilt would set in. I saw it in the way she avoided my gaze afterward, the way her fingers trembled just slightly when she reached for a pen. She would tell herself it had to end, that we were losing control. I should have agreed. I should have walked away. But we never did, because the pull between us was stronger than reason, stronger than the fear of consequence. And each time we gave in, the restraint cracked a little more. Like the night she didn't go to the utility room right away. Instead, she grabbed my wrist as I turned to leave, her grip firm, unspoken words burning in her eyes. And before I could ask what she was thinking, she pulled me toward her, her lips crashing into mine. This wasn't hesitation. It wasn't a slow, lingering kiss like before. It was heat and need, a fire barely contained. Her hands tangled in my hair, mine gripping the curve of her waist, pressing her against the supply closet door. I could feel the rapid rise and fall of her breath, the way she melted against me even as she fought herself. When she finally pulled away, her lips were swollen, her pupils blown wide. She exhaled shakily, then turned and disappeared into the utility room without a word. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath, knowing, just like she did, that we had already gone too far. And that we weren't going to stop. We had been reckless before, but that night we pushed too far. The clinic was nearly empty, the last patients gone, the hallways silent except for the distant hum of medical equipment. It should have felt safer. It should have been easier to control. But control had left us long ago. She had been locking up when I found her, the keys still in her hand. One glance was all it took. I backed her against the wall before either of us could think better of it, my fingers sliding into her ponytail, tilting her head back. She met me without hesitation, her lips parting as I kissed her, deep, consuming, the kind of kiss that left no space for doubt. Her hands gripped my shirt, pulling me closer, as if the distance between us had ever been a choice. I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, the way she gasped softly when my lips moved down to her jaw, her neck. Every sound she made, every shiver beneath my touch, only pulled me deeper into the moment. Then footsteps, loud, unmistakable, heading straight toward us. We froze. My breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm against mine. For a second, neither of us moved. The footsteps slowed outside the door, a pause that made my pulse slam against my ribs. She swallowed hard, her hand gripping my wrist where I still held her. Then, with a barely there shake of her head, she pushed me back, smoothing the front of her scrubs with trembling fingers. A shadow passed beneath the door. The handle didn't turn. The footsteps started again, fading down the hall. We stood there in the heavy silence, neither of us speaking, both of us knowing exactly what had just happened. Too close. Her hands were still gripping my shirt, her breath still uneven. But when her eyes met mine, something had changed. This time she meant it. "This has to stop," she whispered. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I could convince her otherwise. The weight of her words settled between us, heavier than before. She didn't move right away. Neither did I. For a moment, I thought she might take it back, that she'd reach for me like she always did, that she'd give in just one more time. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. This wasn't hesitation, it was a decision. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk away just yet. "You don't want this to stop," I murmured, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. She exhaled, closing her eyes briefly as if steadying herself. And then, before I could say anything else, she reached up, fingers threading into my hair, pulling me into a kiss that didn't feel like an ending. It was deep, slow, deliberate, nothing like the desperate, stolen moments before. It was full of everything we hadn't said, every unspoken want, every memory we would have to carry after this. Her hands trembled against my face, her breath uneven as she leaned into me like she wasn't ready to let go. But she did. She pulled back first, her forehead pressing to mine for a lingering second before she whispered, "We can't?" I nodded, though everything in me rebelled against it. There were no promises, no final words that could make it easier. Just the quiet space between us, thick with something neither of us could hold on to anymore. And then I turned, walking away before I could give her a reason to change her mind. I didn't look back, because if I did, I wasn't sure I'd be able to leave at all. Days passed, but she never really left me. Her touch still lingered on my skin. The way she had kissed me, slow, final, like she was memorizing every second. I replayed it in my mind, searching for something I might have missed, some hesitation that meant she didn't really want to end it. But all I found was the same truth, she had meant it. I stayed away from the clinic. It was easier that way, easier to pretend that what happened between us had been nothing more than a fleeting moment, a mistake we had barely stopped from unraveling completely. But at night, when sleep refused to come, I could still feel her. Then, just when I thought I was starting to let go, a message arrived. A single line. "We need to talk." My chest tightened, because I already knew this wasn't over. I met her at a small cafe, the kind of place where no one paid attention, where conversations dissolved into the hum of background noise. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, her fingers curled around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She looked up when I stepped inside. No smile, no hesitation, just a steady gaze that told me she had thought about this moment just as much as I had. I sat across from her, the silence stretching between us. For the first time in weeks, there were no stolen touches, no breathless moments between walls that weren't meant to hold us. Just this, just the weight of everything we had done, everything we couldn't take back. "I don't regret it," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Neither did I. But we both know there's no way forward." She exhaled, staring down into her coffee like it held the answer we both already knew. It was never supposed to happen. I swallowed, my throat tight. But it did. Her fingers twitched against the cup, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked up at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw it. That same pull, that same ache that had kept bringing us back together. But this time, she didn't reach for me. And I didn't reach for her. Because this wasn't a moment meant to be stolen. It was meant to be let go. She stood first, hesitating just slightly before nodding. "Goodbye, Ethan." I didn't say it back, because some things don't need words. She walked away and I let her. I sat there long after she was gone, staring at the empty chair across from me, the faint warmth of her presence already fading. The cafe buzzed around me, life moving forward as if nothing had changed. But I told myself I would forget, that time would smooth over the edges of what we had been, dull the sharpness of her absence. But some things don't fade. Some things settle into you, quiet and unshakable. I avoided the clinic, avoided the places where I might see her. But I still felt her, in the way my pulse quickened at the thought of her touch, in the way my body remembered hers even when my mind tried to let go. We were a moment, nothing more. A moment that burned too brightly, Too briefly, before it collapsed under the weight of reality. I told myself it was for the best. But that didn't mean I didn't miss her. Because some stories don't have perfect endings. But that doesn't mean they don't leave a mark.